At 200 hours on November 2nd, 1944, the Hürtgen Forest was not a place you entered so much as a place that closed behind you. Rain had been falling for days, turning every trail into a seam of mud and every shallow ditch into black water. Above the treetops, the sky was a low, wet ceiling that swallowed sound until artillery arrived and made the forest speak in splintered trunks and falling branches. A rifle company from the 28th Infantry Division waited on the edge of the trees, shoulders hunched under soaked wool and heavy packs, listening to the last checks of rifles and radio sets that already sounded uncertain in the damp. They were new to this kind of country, new to the way the ground rose and dropped without warning, new to the feeling that you could be watched from 10 meters away and never see the eyes. Somewhere ahead lay the objectives that looked simple on a map. Villages with names they could barely pronounce. Ridgelines that seemed like pencil marks until you had to climb them under fire. Pa.nung.mil in the dark. The platoon leader moved down the line, touching a shoulder here, meeting a glance there, not giving a speech, not pretending certainty. The men had been told the forest would grind them down. The Germans believed it would break them. In a few hours, no one would be thinking about belief at all. To the German commanders watching the approaches to the Hürtgen Forest, there was nothing mysterious about what would happen next. The Americans had been in Europe only a few months. They had broken out of Normandy with speed and firepower, not with the slow discipline of men accustomed to fighting at arm's length. In German assessments, American infantry was a weapon system that functioned best when surrounded by artillery, aircraft, and roads wide enough to move supplies without friction. Strip those things away, and the system would falter. The forest promised exactly that. The Hürtgen was dense, wet, and uneven, a place where observation collapsed to a few dozen meters, and radio signals dissolved into static. Artillery spotting was unreliable beneath the canopy. Tanks could not maneuver without becoming targets. Air support, the Americans' greatest advantage, was often grounded by low clouds and winter rain. To German officers who had fought since 1939, this terrain favored the defender and punished the attacker. More importantly, it punished the unseasoned attacker. German doctrine had long emphasized the psychological dimension of infantry combat. Units were trained to identify the moment when an opponent's cohesion began to crack, then apply pressure until resistance collapsed. This approach had worked repeatedly against enemies whose formations were rigid or whose soldiers lacked confidence in prolonged close combat. Reports from earlier encounters with American forces reinforced the same conclusion. When Americans were pinned down without immediate support, they tended to halt. When casualties mounted without visible progress, their attacks slowed. In open country, firepower masked these tendencies. In the forest, there would be nowhere to hide them. Within German staff discussions, the Americans were not dismissed as cowards. That word belonged to propaganda, not planning. The assessment was more clinical. American soldiers were believed to be insufficiently conditioned for sustained infantry fighting under isolation. Their training emphasized coordination and overwhelming force, not endurance under attrition. They were thought to rely on rotation, relief, and replacement to maintain effectiveness. In a place like the Hürtgen Forest, those mechanisms would fail. Winter reinforced this expectation. German units had learned, often at terrible cost on the Eastern Front, that cold and fatigue eroded morale faster than enemy fire. American soldiers, many drawn from climates far from the European winter, were assumed to be even more vulnerable. Wet boots, sleepless nights, and constant artillery harassment would do what direct assaults could not. The forest would exhaust them before it destroyed them. The German defensive plan reflected this belief. Positions were not designed for dramatic counterattacks or sweeping maneuvers. Instead, they were arranged to deny movement and amplify uncertainty. Small units occupied mutually supporting positions, camouflaged and silent, allowing the terrain to fight alongside them. Mines and obstacles slowed progress. Artillery was registered on likely avenues of approach, not to annihilate attacking units outright, but to keep them off balance and awake. The goal was not to defeat the Americans in a single blow, but to let time and terrain do the work. From this perspective, the Hürtgen Forest was not a decisive battlefield, but a proving ground. If the Americans broke here, it would confirm long-standing assumptions about their limitations. If they stalled, the German line along the western approaches would gain breathing space. Either outcome favored the defender. The possibility that American infantry might adapt, endure, and continue fighting without collapsing did not factor heavily into planning. It was considered unlikely, almost theoretical. For the German soldiers holding the forest, this confidence filtered down in subtle ways. They expected resistance, but not persistence. They prepared for repeated American attacks, followed by pauses, withdrawals, and reorganization. They believed the forest would magnify every American weakness while minimizing German ones. In their minds, the terrain was already an ally, and allies, once proven, were trusted. What none of them could see from their maps and reports was how American units would respond once the assumptions underpinning those plans began to erode. That realization would come slowly, not in a single engagement or dramatic breakthrough, but in the accumulation of days when positions were held instead of abandoned, when attacks resumed instead of fading away. The forest was supposed to break American infantry. The first sign that it might not came quietly, without ceremony, and without anyone on the German side immediately understanding its significance. The German expectation that American infantry would falter in the Hürtgen Forest did not emerge in isolation. It was the product of years of experience, doctrine, and comparison, shaped long before the first American units stepped beneath the trees. German infantry culture had been forged in a different war. From the opening campaigns in Poland and France, German units learned to value cohesion under pressure and initiative at the lowest levels. Small unit leaders were trained to operate with minimal guidance, adapting quickly to changing conditions. In the early years of the war, this approach repeatedly paid dividends. Opponents whose forces relied on centralized control or rigid planning often collapsed once their systems were disrupted. To German officers, this was not a matter of national character, but of military conditioning. Their subsequent experiences reinforced the lesson. On the Eastern Front, German infantry endured some of the harshest conditions imaginable. Winters were longer and colder than anything in Western Europe. Supply lines stretched thin. Units were often understrength, isolated, and outnumbered. Survival depended on discipline, improvisation, and a tolerance for sustained hardship. Those who could not endure were removed by attrition. Those who remained became the standard against which other armies were measured. When German units first encountered American forces in North Africa and later in Italy, they viewed them through this lens. American operations were effective, but in a particular way. Attacks were carefully prepared, supported by heavy artillery and, when possible, air power. Movement was deliberate. When resistance stiffened, American units often paused to bring up additional fire support. To German observers, this suggested a force optimized for methodical advance, rather than prolonged close combat without support. These impressions were reinforced by intelligence reports and after-action assessments. German analysts noted the scale of American logistical capability and the emphasis placed on coordination between arms. They also observed that American units rotated personnel more frequently, replacing losses with new arrivals rather than keeping formations intact through long periods of attrition. From a German perspective, this appeared efficient but psychologically fragile. Cohesion, they believed, was built over time, not maintained through constant replacement. Training differences further shaped perception. German infantry training emphasized operating in broken terrain, making use of cover, and maintaining combat effectiveness under exhaustion. American training, by contrast, was understood to focus on standardized procedures, firepower integration, and adherence to plans. None of this was inherently flawed, but it suggested different strengths. In open terrain or during rapid advances, American methods excelled. In dense forest, where visibility was limited and contact was constant, German officers believed those advantages would disappear. The Hürtgen Forest seemed to confirm every assumption. It resembled terrain where German infantry had historically performed well and where less experienced forces struggled. Narrow trails restricted movement. Artillery fire was difficult to observe and adjust. Units became fragmented, and command often devolved to small groups acting on their own. For German planners, this environment favored soldiers accustomed to fighting without clear lines or immediate reinforcement. There was also a cultural component, though it was rarely stated openly in professional assessments. German officers tended to view prolonged endurance under hardship as a defining attribute of effective infantry. They believed that armies trained for industrial-scale warfare, supported by vast resources, might lack the internal resilience required when those resources were temporarily unavailable. In the Hürtgen Forest, they expected American soldiers to discover the limits of their system. These beliefs were not irrational. They were grounded in experience, observation, and a coherent understanding of how different armies fought. They also contained a critical flaw. They assumed that adaptation would favor the defender alone, and that American infantry, once deprived of its usual advantages, would remain static in its methods. The possibility that American units might learn, adjust, and endure under conditions they had not been prepared for was acknowledged in theory, but discounted in practice. As American divisions moved deeper into the forest, these assumptions shaped every German response. Defensive positions were designed to delay and exhaust rather than to repel decisively. Attacks were expected to lose momentum. Relief was anticipated, not feared. The forest was doing what it was supposed to do. But beneath the canopy, another process was beginning, one that did not fit neatly into German expectations. It did not announce itself with a breakthrough or a sudden collapse. It emerged in small decisions, repeated night after night, as American units confronted a reality they could not avoid, and began, slowly and unevenly, to change how they fought. The first signs that German expectations might not hold appeared in ways that were easy to dismiss. There was no sudden surge forward, no dramatic assault that announced a change in the character of the fighting. Instead, the pattern of American behavior in the forest began to shift quietly, almost imperceptibly. American infantry units entered the Hürtgen Forest with methods shaped by earlier campaigns. Movement relied on mapped routes. Communication assumed functioning radios. Attacks were planned around scheduled fire support. In the forest, those assumptions unraveled quickly. Radios failed under the canopy. Artillery fire landed late or inaccurately. Units became separated by terrain they could not see across. The initial response was hesitation, then confusion, then loss. What followed was not collapse, but adjustment. Platoons learned that rigid formations were liabilities in dense woods. Patrols became smaller and more frequent. Routes were chosen not for speed, but for concealment. Leaders stopped waiting for perfect coordination and began acting on incomplete information. None of this was doctrinally revolutionary, but it represented a departure from the expectations German commanders held. German defenders noticed that American units began to hold ground differently. Positions that might once have been abandoned after heavy shelling were reoccupied. Listening posts were established and maintained through the night, despite constant harassment. Units rotated men within the line instead of pulling back entirely. These were not spectacular acts of bravery, but they altered the rhythm of the fighting. Casualties mounted, and with them came a test German planners believed the Americans would fail. Relief did not always arrive on schedule. Supply lines were unreliable. Men went days without dry clothing or adequate rest. Yet units remained in place. They complained, they struggled, but they did not disintegrate. Attacks resumed after setbacks. Patrols went back out after ambushes. The forest did not produce the rapid erosion of cohesion German doctrine predicted. This endurance did not stem from sudden mastery of the terrain. American units made mistakes repeatedly. They exposed themselves unnecessarily. They misread enemy positions. They suffered losses that, in hindsight, achieved little. What changed was their willingness to continue operating within those conditions, rather than withdrawing to wait for more favorable circumstances. The forest imposed limits, and instead of rejecting those limits, American infantry began to work within them. German defensive measures were designed to exploit hesitation. Mines, artillery bursts, and sniper fire were intended to freeze movement and drain morale. Against many opponents, this approach had been effective. In the Hürtgen, it began to yield diminishing returns. The Americans adapted by accepting a slower tempo rather than abandoning the fight. Progress was measured in meters, sometimes in hours without movement, but it continued. Reports from the front reflected this subtle shift. German units noted that American attacks, once broken off, often resumed from different directions. Pressure did not disappear when conditions worsened. Nightfall, weather, and casualties did not reliably halt operations. The Americans were not becoming more skillful in a conventional sense, but they were becoming harder to predict. This was the point at which German assumptions began to fray. The forest was still inflicting heavy losses, still favoring the defender, but it was no longer producing the psychological collapse that had been expected. The Americans were absorbing punishment and remaining in contact. They were learning, unevenly and expensively, how to exist in a fight that offered no clear rewards. The decisive factor was not tactical brilliance, but persistence. The German plan relied on the belief that American infantry would seek relief from conditions that stripped away their advantages. Instead, those conditions became the environment in which they continued to operate. The forest was supposed to exhaust them into withdrawal. It was beginning to teach them how to endure. As the fighting settled into its relentless pattern, the Hürtgen Forest ceased to be a series of objectives and became an environment that dictated every decision. Movement slowed to the pace of men feeling their way forward through trees that blocked sight lines and absorbed sound. Orders were given, misunderstood, and revised under conditions that made certainty impossible. What had been planned as a coordinated advance fractured into dozens of local struggles, each shaped by terrain, fatigue, and chance. American platoons advanced without the assurance that support would arrive on time or at all. Artillery, when it came, was often imprecise, Shells burst in treetops, showering fragments downward in ways that punished both attacker and defender. German fire did not announce itself with massed barrages, but with sudden localized violence. Machine guns opening from concealed positions, mortars falling without warning, mines detonating beneath boots already soaked and numb. The forest compressed the fight until decisions were made at distances measured in steps. German units exploited this compression methodically. Defensive positions were arranged to overlap fields of fire without exposing themselves. Withdrawal routes were planned in advance, allowing small groups to disengage and reappear elsewhere. The goal was not to annihilate American units, but to force them into repeated, costly engagements that offered no clear progress. Every delay increased exhaustion. Every casualty tested cohesion. What challenged German expectations was not the absence of these effects, but the American response to them. Units that lost contact did not automatically retreat. Instead, they regrouped where they could and resumed movement. When attacks stalled, they were modified rather than abandoned. Leaders learned to operate without full situational awareness, making decisions based on sound, intuition, and fragmentary reports. These were not ideal conditions, but they became normal. The forest dismantled centralized control. Company commanders often had only a partial understanding of where their platoons were. Platoon leaders made independent choices that shaped the fight in their immediate vicinity. German doctrine had long prized this kind of decentralized initiative. What they did not expect was to encounter it in American units so quickly and at such cost. Endurance replaced momentum as the defining characteristic of the engagement. Days passed with little visible change in the line, yet the pressure did not dissipate. American soldiers continued to occupy forward positions despite casualties that would have justified withdrawal under different circumstances. Relief units entered the forest not as fresh formations, but as replacements stepping into an ongoing struggle, inheriting positions and problems rather than resetting the fight. German reports began to reflect this shift in tone. The Americans were still suffering heavy losses, still advancing slowly, still making errors. But they were not disengaging. Defensive fires that once halted movement now delayed it. Attacks that had been expected to fade instead resumed after short pauses. The anticipated psychological breaking point failed to appear. The forest exacted a brutal toll on both sides. German units were forced to remain alert continuously, denying themselves the respite they had expected the terrain to provide. Positions could not be abandoned casually, because American patrols returned even after being repulsed. Attrition accumulated without resolution. The fight became less about maneuver and more about who could continue to function under sustained pressure. In this environment, the original German assumption that American infantry would collapse when deprived of its usual advantages lost practical value. It no longer explained what was happening on the ground. The Americans were not winning decisively, but they were not withdrawing either. They were adapting in place, absorbing punishment, and continuing to apply pressure in a fight that offered no quick rewards. The Hürtgen Forest did not reward endurance. It consumed it. Yet the Americans remained, and that fact alone altered the character of the battle. What had been conceived as a defensive attritional trap became a prolonged contest of resilience, one in which neither side achieved clarity, but one in which German certainty steadily eroded. The shift in German perception did not arrive as a dramatic admission or a single report that overturned earlier conclusions. It emerged gradually, through accumulated observations that no longer fit established expectations. The language used in assessments changed first, than the assumptions behind them. German commanders noted that American infantry units were no longer behaving as forces on the verge of collapse. Positions that should have been abandoned under sustained fire were being held. Patrol activity continued even after heavy losses. Relief operations, once expected to signal a pause in pressure, did not reliably do so. The Americans were absorbing conditions that German doctrine had identified as breaking points. This realization forced a reassessment that was uncomfortable rather than urgent. The forest was still exacting a high cost on American forces, and from a tactical standpoint, the defensive position remained effective. Yet the core premise, that American infantry lacked the psychological endurance for prolonged close combat without overwhelming support, was no longer supported by evidence. The Americans were not excelling, but they were enduring. Reports began to distinguish between American operational methods and American infantry behavior. While American command structures still relied heavily on coordination and support, the soldiers themselves demonstrated a capacity to function under isolation that had not been fully appreciated. German planners recognized that the enemy was not simply applying doctrine mechanically, but adjusting to circumstances imposed by terrain and weather. This adjustment did not suggest a sudden improvement in American tactical sophistication. German units continued to exploit American errors and inflict losses. What had changed was the absence of the anticipated breaking point. The psychological collapse that had been expected to follow sustained pressure failed to materialize. American units degraded, but they did not disintegrate. The implications of this recognition extended beyond the Hürtgen Forest. German defensive planning along the Western Front had relied on the assumption that American forces could be stalled and worn down in difficult terrain. That assumption now required qualification. If American infantry could endure prolonged attrition without decisive collapse, then delaying actions alone would not guarantee relief. Time would still be bought, but at a higher cost to the defender. This did not lead to an immediate doctrinal shift. The German army in late 1944 lacked the freedom to redesign its approach to the war. Resources were limited, and strategic initiative had already passed to the Allies. What changed instead was the tone of expectation. American infantry was no longer viewed as a force that could be broken through environmental hardship alone. It was recognized as an opponent, capable of absorbing punishment and continuing to operate under unfavorable conditions. In the Hürtgen Forest, this realization arrived too late to alter the course of the fighting there. The battle continued to grind forward without resolution, consuming men and material on both sides. But the forest had already served its unintended purpose. It had exposed the limits of a belief that had guided German planning since the Americans first entered the war. The collapse was not of a defensive line, but of a certainty. German commanders learned that endurance could not be assumed to belong to one side alone. In a war increasingly defined by attrition, that lesson carried a weight far beyond the trees of the Hürtgen. When the fighting in the Hürtgen Forest finally receded into memory, it left behind no clear victory and no satisfying conclusion. Maps showed incremental changes. Reports listed objectives taken and lost. Casualty figures spoke loudly, but not clearly. What remained was a lesson shaped less by outcome than by experience. For the Americans, the forest became a harsh introduction to the realities of sustained ground combat in Western Europe. It exposed gaps in preparation and assumptions about how firepower could compensate for terrain and weather. Infantry units paid heavily for lessons learned under fire: how to operate with unreliable communication, how to maintain cohesion when relief was delayed, and how to function in an environment that offered no tactical elegance. The experience did not validate American doctrine, but it hardened the soldiers who would carry the war forward. For the Germans, the Hürtgen Forest forced a recalibration of how the enemy was understood. American infantry could no longer be categorized simply by its reliance on material advantage. The expectation that hardship alone would fracture cohesion proved incomplete. Endurance, it became clear, was not exclusive to those who had fought since 1939. It could be learned, imposed by circumstance, and sustained even in forces that had not been trained with that outcome in mind. Strategically, the battle did not alter the trajectory of the war in a decisive way. The Western Front continued to shift eastward under Allied pressure. Yet at the level where wars are actually fought, among units holding ground and commanders estimating what an enemy will do next, the implications were lasting. Planning based on psychological collapse rather than physical limitation became less reliable. Delay could still be achieved, but certainty could not. The Hürtgen Forest stands as a reminder that war resists neat categories. Terrain does not guarantee advantage. Doctrine does not dictate behavior. Soldiers do not always conform to the expectations placed upon them by planners and analysts. The forest did what it was meant to do. It consumed time, strength, and lives. What it did not do was break the force it was expected to shatter. In the end, the most important change occurred not on the battlefield, but in understanding. A belief that had guided decisions quietly lost its authority. The Germans learned that American infantry would endure conditions meant to defeat them. The Americans learned that endurance came at a cost that could not be calculated in advance. Between those lessons lay the reality of the Hürtgen Forest, a place where certainty dissolved and where survival itself became the measure of success.